Tony Brooks is a man trying to outrun his past by driving a cab, but the past finds him when he rescues Jia Quan from a Russian kidnapping attempt. By sacrificing his car and risking his life, he earns a debt of gratitude from the city's most dangerous man. The roar of the rain against the roof of the yellow cab was silenced by the sudden, bone-chilling wail of a siren that wasn't coming from a police cruiser. Tony Brooks' hands locked onto the steering wheel of his Crown Victoria, his palms sweating despite the Chicago chill. In the rearview mirror, the high beams of an armored truck blazed through the downpour like the eyes of a predator stalking its prey. His heart thundered, a rhythmic drumming he hadn't felt since his days jumping over the Kandahar province. To his left, a blacked-out SUV veered into his lane, grinding against his fender and cutting off his path to the side street. He was boxed in on a bridge with nowhere to go. In the back seat, Jia Quan let out a sharp, strangled cry. She clutched her rounded stomach, her knuckles white as she gripped the leather upholstery. Jia, the woman who had entered his cab with a gentle smile just 10 minutes ago, was now pale, her breathing shallow and panicked. She was pregnant, terrified, and the target of a hit. Tony saw the passenger door of the truck slide open. Time didn't just slow down, it froze into a jagged crystalline moment. He saw the cold, matte black finish of a submachine gun barrel extending into the rain. His paratrooper training honed through years of assess, decide, act overrode his survival instinct. There was no room for hesitation. "Stay low. Get on the floor," Tony roared, his voice booming with military authority. He didn't wait for her to move. He reached back, his massive hand shielding her head and pushing her toward the floorboards. With his other hand, he shifted the gear into a hard manual low and floorboard the pedal. The taxi didn't just move, it screamed. The engine whined in a high-pitched mechanical protest as the speedometer needle swept past 50, then 70. Tony wasn't looking for a gap in traffic, he was looking for the impact. He yanked the wheel toward the oncoming traffic of Michigan Avenue, aiming his engine block directly at the center mass of the attacking SUV. The collision was apocalyptic. The sound was a symphony of dying machinery, the shriek of tearing steel and the thunderous pop of shattering safety glass. The taxi's front end folded like an accordion. The airbag detonated with a violent punch to Tony's chest, the smell of acrid chemical dust filling his lungs. His head snapped back, then slammed forward, his vision splintering into 1,000 points of white light. Warm, thick blood began to map its way down his cheek from a gash on his temple. The world spun in a dizzying carousel of streetlights and rain. As the car finally groaned to a halt, the silence was instantly shattered by the rhythmic thud-thud-thud of heavy-caliber gunfire. Shouts in Russian echoed over the bridge, followed by the heavy, methodical doors of black sedans slamming shut. The war had arrived. Hours later, the adrenaline had long since curdled into a cold, aching stiffness. Tony sat on a metal bench in a holding cell of the first precinct, the fluorescent lights overhead buzzing like a persistent migraine. His hands, scrubbed clean of the road grime, but still stained with the shadow of gunpowder residue, rested on his knees. He was a person of interest, a taxi driver who had turned a major bridge into a war zone. To the police, he was a liability. To the world outside, he was a dead man walking. The silence of the precinct was interrupted by the heavy, rhythmic click of expensive leather shoes against the linoleum. The air in the room seemed to shift, growing heavy with a localized gravity that signaled the arrival of someone who didn't ask for permission. A detective appeared at the bars, looking uncharacteristically small. Behind him stood a man who looked like he was carved from obsidian. Sung Ho Kwan didn't look like a criminal, he looked like an emperor in mourning. His charcoal gray suit was tailored to perfection, but there was a weariness in the set of his jaw that spoke of a man carrying a collapsing sky. Their eyes met through the bars, Tony's tired, soldierly gaze meeting Sung Ho's piercing, calculating stare. Without a word, the detective turned the key. "Mr. Brooks," Sung Ho said, his voice a low, melodic baritone that carried the weight of a decree. The city thinks you are a reckless driver. I know you are a savior. Walk with me. The ride from the precinct was conducted in a silence so thick it felt physical. They traveled in a fleet of black Suburbans, a motorized phalanx that moved through the Chicago rain with predatory grace. Tony watched the city blur past the tinted glass, realizing his old life, the cab, the quiet mechanic shop dreams had been crushed along with his Crown Vic's fender. They pulled into the underground bay of a private medical facility, a place where the signs were in both English and Hangul, and the security guards carried their weapons with the casual ease of professionals. As they ascended to the private wing, the atmosphere changed from clinical to somber. Sung-ho led Tony toward a large glass viewing window. On the other side, Jia lay in a bed, hooked up to monitors that beeped with a fragile regularity. She looked small amidst the white linens, her hand resting protectively over the swell of her stomach even in sleep. Sung-ho stood by the glass, his reflection ghosting over his wife's face. In that moment, the Mafia boss mask slipped. Tony saw the tremble in the man's fingers as he touched the glass. He saw a man who had all the power in the world but couldn't stop a bullet or a T-bone collision with his bare hands. "They're my entire world," Sung-ho whispered, not looking away from Jia. "The Russians, the Volkovs, they don't care about the rules of the old world. They target the heart because they have none of their own. You saved my heart tonight, Anthony. But the bridge was just the beginning. They will come again, and next time, I may not be there to intercept." Sung-ho turned then, the vulnerability replaced by a terrifying, focused intensity. He looked at Tony's bruised face, at the steady hands of a man who had faced death and didn't blink. The Mafia boss leaned in, the weight of his world pressing down on the space between them. "I have plenty of soldiers, men who know how to kill. But I have very few men who know how to protect. You swerved into traffic not to escape, but to shield. That is a debt of honor I cannot pay with money alone." Tony felt the shift in his own destiny as Sung-ho placed a heavy hand on his shoulder. It wasn't just a gesture of thanks, it was a recruitment. Tony looked back at the woman in the bed, then at the man whose life was a constant siege. He had spent his life protecting a country that had forgotten him. Perhaps it was time to protect a family that would never forget. The debt was signed in the blood on Tony's forehead and the grief in Sung-ho's eyes, an alliance born in the wreckage of a yellow cab. The antiseptic bite of the private hospital wing was a far cry from the exhaust-heavy air of the Chicago streets Tony had called home. He stood by the window of the executive suite, watching the rain continue its relentless assault on the city's skyline. His reflection in the glass looked like a stranger. His face was a map of dark bruises and surgical tape, his civilian clothes rumpled and stained with the ghosts of the crash. Behind him, the heavy oak door clicked shut. Sung-ho Kwon walked to the center of the room, his movements fluid and silent, carrying the kind of stillness that only comes from absolute authority. On the polished mahogany coffee table between them, Sung-ho placed two items with the deliberate care of a man setting a trap. The first was a cashier's check. Even from a distance, Tony could see the string of zeros. It was more money than he would have earned in a decade of driving that yellow cab. It was enough to buy his father's old shop twice over, to move to a coast where the sun actually shone, and to bury the memory of this night forever. The second item was a sleek, leather-bound folder embossed with the Kwon crest, resting beside a heavy, matte black Glock 17. "The check is for the man you were before tonight," Sung-ho began, his voice echoing softly against the glass. "It is a quiet exit. You take it, you disappear, and my accountants will ensure your name is erased from every police report and syndicate ledger. You go back to being a ghost in the machine." He paused, his dark eyes fixed on Tony's steady hands. "The second option is the suit and the gun. It is an entry into a world that doesn't allow for exits. You become the shadow that walks behind my wife. You become the wall the Volkovs cannot climb." Tony looked at the check. It represented the invisible life he had claimed he wanted since leaving the service. No more nightmares, no more orders, just a simple life under the radar. But as he glanced toward the darkened hallway where Jia lay recovering, he felt the familiar, heavy tug of the soldier's burden. He remembered the way her hand had shook when he pushed her to the floorboards, the way she had looked at him as if he were the only solid thing in a world turned to glass. "Why me?" Tony asked, his voice gravelly. "You have an army of men who'd kill for that seat." "I have an army of men who know how to take lives," Sung-ho replied, stepping closer until he was within Tony's personal space. "I saw you on that bridge, Anthony. You didn't reach for a weapon first. You reached for her. You sacrificed your only means of survival to create a shield. My men are trained to win wars. You are built to save lives. That is a distinction the Volkovs will underestimate." The silence in the room stretched, heavy with the weight of a life-altering crossroads. Tony thought about the quiet, empty apartment waiting for him and the grease-stained floors of a shop he'd have to work 20 more years to own. Then he thought about the lethal precision of the men who had come for the woman in his backseat. He realized that once you've seen the monster in the dark, you can't go back to pretending it doesn't exist. Tony stepped away from the window. His hand didn't even hover over the check. Instead, he reached out and picked up the matte black pistol, checking the chamber with a practiced, metallic slide that hissed through the quiet room. The weight of the steel felt right, more honest than the paper next to it. "I don't need the money to disappear," Tony said, meeting Sung-ho's gaze with a hard, unwavering stare. "But if I'm wearing the suit, I run the security my way. No interference. No secrets." A ghost of a smile touched Sung-ho's lips, a grim, satisfied expression. He reached into his jacket and pulled out a burner phone, sliding it across the table toward the soldier. "Your old life ended on that bridge, Mr. Brooks. Welcome to the family. Your first shift begins at dawn." Tony nodded once, the transition complete. He wasn't a driver anymore. He was the shield of the Quan Syndicate, and for the first time in years, the mission felt personal. He left the check sitting on the table, a scrap of paper belonging to a man who no longer existed. The transition from the driver's seat of a battered Crown Victoria to the tailored shoulders of a charcoal wool suit felt like donning a suit of armor that was 2 sizes too small for Tony's soul. He stood in the mirrored foyer of the Quan estate, adjusting the earpiece that hummed with the silent, rhythmic check-ins of the perimeter team. He was no longer Anthony Brooks. He was Shadow Lead, a ghost tethered to the radiant orbit of Jia Quan. When she stepped out of the elevator, the morning sun catching the amber highlights in her hair, Tony straightened. She looked fragile in a flowing silk dress that barely concealed the life growing within her, yet there was a newfound iron in her gaze that hadn't been there on the bridge. "You look uncomfortable, Tony," she said, her voice soft but carrying a playful edge as she moved toward the waiting motorcade. "The suit is beautiful, but I think you miss your leather jacket." "I miss being invisible, ma'am," Tony replied, his eyes already scanning the tree line and the shadowed corners of the courtyard. He opened the heavy, armored door of the SUV, his hand hovering near the small of his back where the Glock rested. Visibility is a liability. He expected the day to be a series of high-stakes meetings in glass boardrooms or tense standoffs in smoke-filled clubs. Instead, the motorcade wound its way out of the affluent suburbs and into the heart of Chicago's neglected South Side. They pulled up to a refurbished community center where a line of people stretched around the block. Tony's internal alarms blared. This was a tactical nightmare: open spaces, unvetted crowds, and a dozen high-ground vantage points. "Stay close," he muttered into his collar, signaling the rest of the detail to tighten the diamond formation. But as Jia stepped out, the tension in the air didn't escalate into violence, it dissolved into reverence. These weren't syndicate soldiers or rival thugs. They were mothers with crying infants, elderly men with weathered hands, and teenagers looking for a way out. Tony watched, mesmerized, as Jia moved among them. She didn't lead with the shadow of her husband's name. She led with her own light. She sat in cramped offices reviewing medical grants, handed out school supplies, and listened to stories of struggle with an intensity that Tony recognized from the battlefield, the look of a person who refused to leave anyone behind. "She is the sun," a voice murmured beside him. It was Minho, a veteran Quan soldier who usually looked like he was made of granite. "Sungho handles the winter so she can keep the summer alive. Without her foundations, the syndicate is just another gang. She gives the people a reason to choose us over the Russians." Tony watched her kneel, with some difficulty, to speak to a young boy who had lost his father to street violence. She spoke in a mix of Korean and English, her hands steady as she wiped a tear from the boy's cheek. In that moment, Tony realized his assignment wasn't just about protecting a mafia wife, it was about guarding a sanctuary. Jia was the moral compass of an empire built on blood, the bridge between the ruthlessness of the Quan name and the humanity of the city they occupied. As the afternoon light began to fade, casting long, skeletal shadows across the pavement, Tony felt a shift in his own perspective. He had spent years protecting borders and interests that felt abstract and cold. Here, watching Jia promise a mother that her daughter's surgery would be covered by the foundation, the stakes became intimate. He wasn't just a paid gun anymore. He was the barrier between the darkness of the Volkovs and the only thing in the city that still felt pure. When they finally returned to the car, Jia looked exhausted, her hand resting heavily on her stomach. "You did well today, Tony," she whispered as he pulled the door shut. "I know it wasn't the excitement you're used to." "On the contrary, ma'am," Tony said, catching her reflection in the rearview mirror. He saw the fatigue in her eyes, but also the flickering warmth of a job done with purpose. "I think I finally understand the mission." As the motorcade pulled away, Tony didn't just watch for threats in the rearview mirror. He watched the people they left behind, realizing that if Jia was the sun, he would gladly be the eclipse that stood in the way of anyone trying to put out her light. The suit didn't feel so tight anymore. It felt like duty. The clinical sterile scent of the prenatal clinic usually offered a brief reprieve from the heavy, blood-soaked atmosphere of the syndicate, but to Tony, the silence of the underground parking garage felt like a coiled snake. He stood by the driver's side of the armored SUV, his eyes tracing the concrete pillars and the dark oil stains on the floor. Jia walked beside him, glowing with the news of a healthy checkup, her hand resting on her stomach as she hummed a soft Korean lullaby. It was a moment of peace that Tony's military instinct screamed was an illusion. The hair on his arm stood up a split second before the first muzzle flash illuminated the gloom. A silver sedan lurched from a darkened corner, the screech of its tires echoing like a banshee. Tony didn't think. He reacted with the muscle memory of 100 skirmishes. In one fluid motion, he hooked his arm around Jia's waist and practically threw her into the back seat of the SUV, slamming the heavy door just as a hail of 9mm rounds sparked against the reinforced glass. "Stay down." Under the seat, Tony roared, his voice dropping into the low, terrifying rasp of a commanding officer. He didn't scramble for cover. He drew his Glock and used the engine block as a shield, his breathing rhythmic and shallow. The attackers, 3 men in tactical vests, spilled out of the sedan, their movements disciplined but predictable. These weren't street thugs, they were Volkov professionals. Tony waited, counting the seconds between their bursts of fire. He knew their rhythm. When the lead shooter paused to reload, Tony pivoted. He fired 2 precise shots, not at the men, but at the overhead sprinkler pipes and the gas tank of a parked car near them. The garage was instantly plunged into a chaotic mist of freezing water and gasoline fumes. Under the cover of the spray, Tony moved like a wraith. He closed the distance in 3 long strides, his silhouette a blur in the strobing light of the garage's flickering fluorescence. The first attacker never saw him coming. Tony used the butt of his pistol to shatter the man's jaw, then spun, catching the second shooter in his sights. 2 suppressed thuds followed, center mass, then a neutralizing shot. The third man, panicked by the sudden disappearance of his team in the mist, sprayed his submachine gun wildly. Tony dropped to a knee, sighted the target through the water droplets on his glasses, and ended the threat with a single, cold-blooded squeeze of the trigger. The garage fell into a haunting silence, broken only by the hiss of the broken sprinklers. Tony didn't holster his weapon. He scanned the perimeter, checking the high ground and the exit ramps before returning to the SUV. He opened the door to find Gia huddled on the floor, trembling but unharmed. "It's clear," he whispered, his hand reaching out to steady her. "We're moving. Now." He drove with a controlled ferocity, navigating the back alleys of Chicago until they reached the fortified sanctuary of the Quan headquarters. When the elevator doors opened at the penthouse, Sung-ho was already there, surrounded by a dozen frantic soldiers. The Mafia boss looked at his wife's pale face, then at Tony, whose suit was drenched in water and flecked with the soot of gunfire. Sung-ho stepped forward, his eyes searching Tony's for the truth of what had happened. He saw no fear, only the grim satisfaction of a mission accomplished. The boss looked at his security footage being fed to his tablet, watching Tony single-handedly dismantle a professional hit squad in under 60 seconds. Without a word, Sung-ho reached out and gripped Tony's forearm, a warrior's greeting that bypassed the formalities of boss and employee. In the syndicate, loyalty was bought, but trust was forged in the fire. "They sent a wolf to kill a lamb," Sung-ho said, his voice trembling with a rare, raw emotion. "They didn't realize a lion was guarding the gate." Sung-ho turned to his captains, his voice turning to ice. "Anthony Brooks is no longer just security. He is my eyes and my hands. From this moment, his word is my word. If he says the sky is falling, you grab a shield." Do I make myself clear? The chorus of "Yes, boss" echoed through the hall, but Tony barely heard it. He was looking at his hands, still steady, realizing that while he had saved Gia again, he had officially crossed the point of no return. He wasn't just a driver or a guard anymore. He was the syndicate's most lethal asset, and Sung-ho's absolute trust was the heaviest chain of all. The air in the sub-basement of the Quan estate was thick with the scent of aged cedar, expensive scotch, and the metallic tang of fresh ink. This wasn't the sterile, glass-walled Chicago that the public saw. This was the sanctum, a place where the modern skyline faded into the deep, ancestral roots of the syndicate. Tony stood at the center of a circle of high-ranking captains, his white dress shirt discarded, his broad shoulders catching the flickering light of the surrounding candles. He felt the weight of their collective gaze, a mix of hard-earned respect and the lingering wariness of men who had lived their entire lives behind these walls. Sung-ho stepped forward, no longer the man in the charcoal business suit, but a leader draped in a heavy black silk robe embroidered with silver dragons. In his hand, he carried a traditional Korean tattooing needle, and beside him, an elder of the community held a small bowl of dark, obsidian ink. But this ceremony was not solely a relic of the East. On a small table to Tony's left sat a glass of top-shelf bourbon and a single, polished brass shell casing from the garage shootout, the urban symbols of Tony's own history and the blood he had already spilled for the family. "Integration is not erasure," Sung-ho said, his voice a low vibration that seemed to pull the shadows closer. "You do not stop being the man from the streets of Chicago, Anthony. But tonight, that man finds a home. You carry our name, and we carry your burden." The ceremony began with the ink. The elder dipped the needle, and Sung-ho leaned in, his touch surprisingly steady as he began the painstaking process of marking Tony's upper back. The pain was rhythmic, a sharp, stinging heat that Tony welcomed. It was a physical manifestation of the commitment he was making. The design was a fusion, a powerful Korean dragon coiling around a stylized set of paratrooper wings, a permanent marriage of Tony's past and his future. As the needle pierced his skin, the rhythm of the city outside seemed to pulse through the floorboards, the rumble of the L train, the distant sirens, the heartbeat of the South Side. Midway through the marking, Sung-ho paused. He picked up the brass shell casing and dropped it into the ink bowl, the metal clinking softly. "The blood you shed to protect my wife is already part of this ink," Sung-ho whispered. Then, following the old tradition, Sung-ho made a shallow cut on his own palm with a small silver blade and let a single drop of his blood fall into the mixture. He offered the blade to Tony. Without hesitation, Tony took the steel and mirrored the cut on his own hand. They clasped palms, their blood mingling in a silent, unbreakable pact that transcended any legal contract. It was the blood oath, a bond that meant Tony was no longer an employee or even a trusted soldier, he was kin. The elder then poured the bourbon into 2 small ceramic cups. Tony and Sung-ho drank in unison, the burn of the alcohol marking the finality of the transition. The captains erupted into a rhythmic clapping, a sound that echoed the cadences Tony had heard in the barber shops and boxing gyms of his youth. It was a bridge built across 2 different worlds, anchored by the universal language of loyalty. As the elder finished the last lines of the tattoo, Tony felt a strange sense of peace settle over him. The savior complex that had haunted him since his discharge finally had a direction, a purpose that wasn't dictated by a government, but by a man who looked him in the eye. When he finally stood and pulled his shirt back on, the fabric felt different against his skin. He was marked. He was claimed. As he walked out of the basement and into the cool Chicago night to begin his watch over Gia, the city felt smaller, as if it finally belonged to him just as much as he belonged to the syndicate. The ink was still fresh, stinging with every movement, a constant reminder that the driver who had swerved into traffic to save a stranger was dead, and the shadow of the Kwon family had truly been born. The war room of the Kwon estate was a high-tech fortress of shimmering monitors and hushed whispers, but to Tony, it felt like a tactical operations center in a forward base. While the syndicate's old guard focused on brute force and retaliatory strikes against the Russian perimeter, Tony sat in the corner, his eyes fixed on a digital map of their logistics chain. He wasn't looking at the front lines, he was looking at the gaps in the armor. His paratrooper training had taught him that the most dangerous enemy isn't the one across the field, but the one sitting at your table. For weeks, the Volkovs had been ghosting their shipments with impossible precision. Every time a Kwon convoy moved, the Russians were already there, waiting in the shadows. Sung-ho paced the room, his frustration radiating like a heat signature. He was ready to burn the city down to find the leak, but Tony remained motionless, a predator watching the tall grass. He had spent the last 48 hours cross-referencing transit logs with the security detail's biometric check-ins, looking for a pattern that shouldn't exist. "The Russians aren't clairvoyant, boss," Tony said, his voice cutting through the heated debate of the captains like a cold blade. He stood up and tapped a specific point on the monitor, a minor distribution hub in the West Loop. "And they aren't hacking our encrypted comms. They're following a heartbeat." The room went silent. Tony brought up a submenu of the internal security feed. "Every time we've been hit, the response time of the Volkov intercept team has been under 3 minutes. That's not a reaction, that's a preset coordinate. But look at the fuel consumption logs for the secondary escort vehicles." He highlighted a line of data. "Vehicle 7 has been idling for 10 minutes prior to every departure. It's a signal, a digital breadcrumb left in the GPS cache." Sung-ho leaned in, his eyes narrowing. "Who manages the cache for the escort fleet?" "It's not a manager," Tony replied, his gaze shifting toward the door where a young, ambitious lieutenant named Jiro stood guard. "It's a ghost. Someone who knows that the best way to hide a mountain is in a range of hills." Tony walked toward Jiro, his stride measured and heavy. The lieutenant's posture stiffened, his eyes darting toward the exit. "You've been remarkably lucky, Jiro. Every convoy you've sat out on has been decimated. Everyone you've led has been miraculously bypassed." "You're reaching, Brooks," Jiro spat, though a bead of sweat tracked down his temple. "You've been here 5 minutes and you think you're a detective?" Tony didn't argue. He reached out with lightning speed, pinning Jiro against the mahogany door and reaching into the man's tactical vest. He pulled out a secondary, non-encrypted burner phone, the kind used by the Volkov street soldiers. On the screen was a single sent message: "The sun moves at midnight." A collective intake of breath hissed through the room. The betrayal was absolute. Sung-ho approached Jiro, his face a mask of terrifying, quiet rage, but he kept his eyes on Tony. The boss realized then that Tony's value wasn't just in the iron of his grip or the lead in his gun. It was the clarity of his mind, the ability to see the battlefield not as a series of brawls, but as a complex machine that could be dismantled. "Take him to the basement," Sung-ho whispered, never breaking eye contact with Tony. "And Anthony? Prepare a countermaneuver. If they want to follow our heartbeat, let's give them a pulse that leads straight into an abyss." Tony nodded, already turning back to the monitors. The strategy of war wasn't about who had more men, it was about who controlled the information. As he began rerouting the midnight convoy to a kill zone in the industrial docks, Tony felt the last vestiges of the cab driver fade away. He was no longer just protecting Jia, he was orchestrating the survival of an empire. He was the architect now, and the Russians were about to find out that the man behind the wheel was the most dangerous strategist they had ever encountered. In the world of the Syndicate, a bullet could kill a man, but a mind like Tony's could decapitate an organization. The cold Chicago winter had finally settled into the bones of the city, but the chill Tony felt as he stared at his buzzing burner phone had nothing to do with the temperature. He was standing in the shadows of the Kwan Estates nursery, watching Jia sleep, when the message arrived. It wasn't a demand, it was a photo. His younger brother, Marcus, was tied to a rusted chair in a basement that smelled of damp concrete and motor oil, a jagged bruise blooming across his jaw. Marcus was a graduate student, a kid who had stayed clean while Tony went to war, the one piece of Tony's soul that hadn't been hardened by lead and ink. A second later, the phone hissed with a voice that sounded like grinding gravel. "You've made our lives very difficult, Mr. Brooks." The Russian accent was thick, mocking. "You gave the Kwans a mind they didn't have. Now, we give you a choice. At the gala tomorrow night, you will disable the perimeter sensors on the north gate. Do this, and your brother walks. Fail, and we send him back to you in pieces small enough to fit in your taxi's glove box." The line went dead, leaving Tony in a silence so heavy it felt like he was drowning. For the first time since the bridge, the savior complex that defined him was at war with itself. To save his blood, he had to betray his bond. To protect Marcus, he had to leave Jia and her unborn child defenseless against a pack of wolves. He leaned his forehead against the cool glass of the window, his breath fogging the view of the city he had sworn to guard. Throughout the following day, Tony moved like a ghost through the estate. He checked the armory, adjusted the shifts, and looked Sung-ho in the eye while his chest felt like it was filled with hot glass. Every time he saw the fresh ink on his arm, the dragon coiling around the wings, it felt like it was burning into his skin. Sung-ho noticed the distance, the way Tony's hand lingered a fraction too long on his weapon, but the boss attributed it to the tension of the impending gala. "You look like a man carrying the weight of the world, Anthony," Sung-ho said as they prepared for the evening. "Remember, you aren't carrying it alone anymore." The irony was a physical blow. Tony watched Marcus's face in his mind, the kid who had looked up to him like he was a god, and then he looked at Jia, who was currently laughing with a staff member about baby names. The Volkovs hadn't just targeted a person, they had targeted Tony's fundamental identity. They wanted to prove that his integrity was a commodity that could be bought with fear. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long, bloody shadows across the Chicago skyline, Tony stood before the North Gate control panel. The gala was in full swing. The music drifted from the ballroom, a hauntingly beautiful contrast to the violence lurking in the dark. His thumb hovered over the override switch. If he flipped it, the bratva would pour through, and the resulting massacre would be on his hands. If he didn't, the only family he had left by blood would be extinguished before dawn. His paratrooper training screamed at him to find a third way, to assess, decide, act, but there were no maneuvers for this. The stakes weren't tactical anymore, they were a surgical strike on his heart. The red light of the sensor blinked at him like a mocking eye. In the distance, a phone chimed, the final warning from the Volkovs. Tony's hand trembled, a rare and terrifying sign of a man pushed to his absolute breaking point. He was caught between two families, two oaths, and a choice that would leave him a traitor no matter which path he took. The driver who had swerved into traffic to save a stranger was now facing a head-on collision he couldn't drive his way out of. He took a long, jagged breath, reached for his radio, and made the hardest decision of his life. Tony did not flip the switch. Instead, he keyed his radio, his voice a low, steady hum that betrayed none of the tectonic pressure fracturing his chest. "Phoenix to Dragon," he murmured, using the tactical call signs they had established. "The bait is set. Bring the cage." He had realized in the 11th hour that the Volkovs didn't just want the North Gate open, they wanted the satisfaction of breaking him. They expected a desperate man to fold, and in that expectation, they had left themselves wide open. Tony didn't disable the sensors. Instead, he fed the Russians a looped video feed of the North Gate appearing to go dark, while he physically moved into the kill zone. He stepped out into the biting wind of the industrial shipping yard behind the estate, his hands raised, his silhouette illuminated by a single flickering street lamp. He looked like a man who had given up. In his pocket, his burner phone buzzed. The Russians were gloating. "I'm here," Tony said into the open line, his breath blooming in the cold air. "I did what you asked. Bring my brother. Now." From the darkness of the surrounding shipping containers, 3 black vans emerged like sharks through ink. A dozen Volkov soldiers spilled out, led by a man with a scarred throat who dragged a battered, bound Marcus by the collar. The Russian sneered, the barrel of his pistol pressed against Marcus's temple. "You chose well, Brooks. Family first. It's a pity the Kwans won't live long enough to appreciate your sacrifice." Tony's eyes locked onto Marcus. In the boy's terrified gaze, Tony saw the reflection of the man he used to be, helpless and afraid of the dark. But Tony wasn't that man anymore. "You're right," Tony said, a grim, terrifying smile touching his lips. "Family first." That was the signal. The loop on the security monitors was cut, and the floodlights of the estate turned the yard into a blinding white arena. From the rooftops, Sung-ho's elite marksmen, the men Tony had spent weeks training, opened fire with surgical precision. The first volley didn't hit the Russians. It hit the tires of their vans and the ground at their feet, pinning them in place. Tony didn't wait for the chaos to settle. He moved with the explosive speed of a man who had spent his life preparing for this exact moment of violence. He didn't draw his gun. He drew a tactical blade, closing the gap between him and Marcus's captor before the Russian could even register the shift in the light. He drove his shoulder into the man's chest, shielding Marcus with his own body as he swept the Russian's legs. The pistol went skittering across the concrete. "Dragon is in play," Tony roared into his comms. From the shadows, Sung-ho himself emerged, leading a phalanx of syndicate soldiers. They didn't come with the frantic energy of a brawl. They came with the cold, methodical march of an execution squad. The Volkovs, trapped between the high-ground snipers and the advancing Kwan wall, realized too late that they hadn't kidnapped the brother of a driver. They had kidnapped the brother of a wolf. The skirmish was short, brutal, and one-sided. Tony ignored the gunfire and the shouting, his focus entirely on Marcus. He sliced through the zip ties with a steady hand and pulled his brother into a crushing embrace. "I've got you," he whispered, his voice cracking for the first time. "I've got you, Mark. It's over." Sung-ho approached them as the last of the Volkov survivors were being loaded into the back of Quan trucks for questioning. The boss looked at the two brothers, then at the blood on Tony's knuckles. He didn't ask why Tony hadn't told him about the kidnapping. He didn't need to. He saw the truth in the way Tony had positioned himself as a shield for both his brother and the Quan Gates. "You used yourself as the lure," Sung-ho said, his voice filled with a profound, quiet respect. "You gambled everything on our ability to catch you." "I knew you'd be there, boss," Tony replied, helping Marcus to his feet. "We're family. That's what family does." Sung-ho nodded slowly, then turned to his captains. "The Volkovs tried to use our brother's heart against us. Tonight, we show them that the heart of the Quan Syndicate is made of iron." As the sirens of the Syndicate's private security detail faded into the night, Tony walked Marcus toward the estate. The threat hadn't just been neutralized, it had been dismantled. Tony had passed the ultimate test of loyalty, not by choosing one family over the other, but by proving that anyone who touched his blood would have to answer to his steel. The driver was gone. The Shadow had won his first war. The seasons in Chicago had completed a full cycle since the night the yellow cab was sacrificed on the Michigan Avenue Bridge. The scars on Anthony Tony Brooks' temple had faded into thin silver lines, and the ink on his back had settled into his skin as if it had always been there. He stood on the glass-walled balcony of the newly christened Quan Brooks Maritime Plaza, looking out over the sprawling industrial docks that now served as the lungs of the city's legitimate trade. He wasn't wearing the tactical vest of a bodyguard or the grease-stained jumpsuit of a mechanic. He wore a midnight blue three-piece suit that fit his soldier's frame like a second skin. Inside the boardroom, the air was thick with the scent of celebratory champagne and the quiet hum of high-level logistics. Sung-ho Kwon stood by the mahogany table, but he wasn't looking at ledgers or maps of rival territories. He was holding his infant son, whose dark eyes mirrored the calm that had finally settled over the syndicate. Beside him, Jia looked radiant, no longer the terrified passenger, but the chairperson of a multi-million-dollar charity foundation that had rebuilt 3 South Side neighborhoods. The outcome no one expected wasn't just survival, it was transformation. The war with the Volkovs hadn't ended with a massacre, but with a total strategic takeover. Tony's counterambush at the shipyard had decapitated the Russian leadership, leaving their legitimate assets vulnerable. Under Tony's tactical guidance, the Kwans hadn't burned those assets, they had absorbed them. Sung-ho turned as Tony stepped back inside. The Mafia boss, now increasingly referred to as a global logistics tycoon, raised a glass. The room went silent. The captains were still there, but they were now department heads and directors. The culture of the organization had shifted from the shadows to the sunlight, anchored by the man who had once been just a voice from the front seat of a taxi. "A year ago, I hailed a cab because I needed a ride," Sung-ho said, his voice steady and filled with a profound warmth. "I didn't realize I was hailing the future of this family. Most men in my position look for someone who can follow orders. I've found someone who can lead a movement." He reached into his jacket and pulled out a heavy, silver-plated fountain pen, the same one used to sign the merger that had legalized the Quan Empire. He laid it on the table next to a new set of keys. They weren't keys to a battered Crown Victoria, but to the entire shipping fleet. "Anthony, you saved my wife. You saved my brother. And in doing so, you saved my soul from the darkness this business requires," Sung-ho continued. "I am stepping back to be the father my son deserves. Effective immediately, you are the chief operating officer of Quan Maritime. You aren't my shadow anymore, Tony. You are my partner." The room erupted in applause, not the rhythmic, fearful clapping of the sub-basement, but the genuine respect of an inner circle that had seen Tony's mind at work. Tony looked at the pen, then at the man who had become his brother in every way that mattered. He thought about the yellow cab, the debt, and the isolation of his post-military life. He had wanted to be invisible, but in the heart of the syndicate, he had finally been seen. Tony picked up the pen. His hand was as steady as it had been on the steering wheel during the crash. "I told you once that if I wore the suit, I'd do it my way," Tony said, a rare, genuine smile breaking through his professional mask. That means the clinics stay funded, the docks stay clean, and we never forget the people in the back seats of the cabs we passed to get here. Gia walked over and squeezed Tony's hand, her eyes shimmering with gratitude. We wouldn't have it any other way, Tony. As the sun began to set, casting a golden glow over the shipping containers and the vast expanse of Lake Michigan, Tony Brooks looked out at his empire. He had started as a man driving in circles, trapped by his own trauma and the city's indifference. Now he was the architect of a new legacy. He had swerved into traffic to save a life, and in that moment of selfless violence, he had driven himself straight into a destiny no one, not even the man behind the wheel, could have ever predicted. The taxi driver was gone, replaced by a titan who knew that the greatest power wasn't in the gun or the ink, but in the loyalty that turned strangers into kings.